What's happening with Nintendo's top developers and retirement? Are they all heading out into the sunset, or are they sticking around for more exciting game developments? And in particular, is one Yoshio Sakamoto, who has been working on every side scrolling Metroid since the very first game, still going to be sticking his oar into the next Metroid project when it comes? Yes, as many of Nintendo's very top executives are heading for and indeed are passing retirement age, it's time to examine exactly what the laws and guidelines in Japan are around retirement, what Nintendo's specific policies are, what else we can infer about how Nintendo operates in this regard, and what we can expect from the senior figures at Nintendo going forward. Along the way, I think we're going to get a far better understanding of some of Nintendo's recent decisions and future moves, and of course, we're going to look very specifically at the case of Yoshio Sakamoto. Let's start, in fact, by touching on Sakamoto's situation. Although he's been a bit of a divisive figure for some over the years, Sakamoto has been involved in Metroid since the very beginning, and the way he talked about Metroid Dread has been interpreted as saying that he might have ideas for another game that he theoretically would be working on. In 2024, he referred to having found an heir to continue the Famicom Detective Club series, and that very summer he turned 65. He was credited as a producer on 2026's Tomodachi Life Living the Dream, but not on Rhythm Heaven Groove, and he wasn't in the Ask the Developer interview for the new Tomodachi either. Ultimately, we can't say for sure if Sakamoto is still at Nintendo, although I think I'm going to lay out the likeliest case by the end of the video. But the most compelling immediate evidence we have comes from an interview on the Anime Man channel, and thanks to Pika Phantom VG for highlighting this to me. In an interview with Hashimoto Toru, a former Nintendo employee, Toru states that while he was at the company, and I quote, Sakamoto-san, who made Metroid and is still working on it even now, was there too. That interview was dated May 2026, which is pretty definitive. Now, to be fair, I don't usually know the precise whereabouts of everybody I worked with a couple of decades ago, so I don't necessarily think that this literally means that right now at this very moment, Sakamoto is still at Nintendo working on Metroid, but it should certainly give us pause to consider whether or not he has fully left, and if so, when did he leave? We'll cycle back to this, but first let's talk broad context and understand retirement at Nintendo more generally, the regulatory context in Japan, and the specific changes that Nintendo have been making over the last couple of decades. On the one hand, we've seen top Nintendo people go on and on and on, including, of course, Shigeru Miyamoto, who is 74 in 2026, and Nintendo's former president, Tatsumi Kimishima, who handed the post to Shuntaro Furukawa at the age of 68, and yet was still reportedly attending meetings even after that. Nintendo's longtime technology lead, Genya Takeda, briefly stepped up to co-run the company with Miyamoto in the immediate period after Satoru Iwata's death, and only retired in 2017, also at the age of 68. Most recently, we've learnt that although Takashi Tezuka is leaving his executive role, which, to be fair, he only stepped into relatively recently in 2018, he will remain at the company. On the other hand, we've seen a succession of retirement announcements from key developers. Longtime Mario Kart head honcho Hideki Kono, who for a long time also led Nintendo's efforts on smart devices, retired a few weeks after his 60th birthday. Star Fox and F-Zero designer Takaya Imamura was 54 when he left to pursue his own independent ventures. It's not entirely clear when Kensuke Tanabe, who turned 63 in January 2026, will be going, although he talked in an interview that he was probably going. It was clear in that interview that he said that Beyond would be the last game for the Prime series that he would be working on. Generally, we only know about these exits from interviews or social media because Nintendo don't tend to announce retirements unless they're exceptionally public-facing or financially sensitive roles. So, let's get an understanding of the underlying Japanese law. Traditionally, in Japan's straitened corporate culture, there were strict expectations of when older people would make way for younger leaders to come through. But there are many reasons why this is changing, including, of course, a greater caution around ageism, but also the practical necessity that Japan's age pyramid skews ever older, and it might not be advantageous at a national level to have people head to retirement earlier than needed. The state pension age is set at 65, and the 1971 Act on Stabilization of Employment of Elderly Persons sets a hard limit of age 60 as the youngest age at which companies can oblige their employees to retire, except in a narrow range of fields where age may affect performance too badly, although that's not likely to be an issue for Nintendo. Generally, companies approach this one of three ways. They can either abolish the idea of a retirement age entirely, they could raise the retirement age to 65, or they could institute a different kind of continuous employment system with senior employees offered different kinds of fixed term contracts. Now, this has several advantages to the employers in terms of offering flexibility of how to deal with the workforce and the potential to renegotiate salary terms and work specifications. It also means, of course, that they don't then necessarily have to keep everybody on, and some people will just naturally retire at the specified retirement age, presumably 65. Now, from 2012 to 2025, another piece of legislation has gradually phased in a requirement that anybody aged up to 65 must be offered continual employment as long as they are fit to take it on. So, effectively, since the Switch 2 era, the retirement age nationwide has been 65, not 60. However, there are other options that can be taken up. Larger operations especially take advantage of a paragraph of the Act which permits companies to re-employ existing staff members through subsidiaries or affiliated companies. For example, if someone were to retire from Nintendo Company Limited in Japan, they could be rehired by, for example, Nintendo Pictures or Monolith Soft, and this would still count as continuous employment in effect. There are actually no strict financial penalties at all for failing to meet this requirement, but the reputational damage a breach would incur is still very meaningful in Japanese corporate culture, and so you can bet that Nintendo will follow the letter of the law quite closely. It's not necessarily the case, though, even under the new rules, that employment after 60 is secure or well remunerated. Companies offering continuation contracts are not obliged to offer equivalent salaries or hours, and frequently these are one-year contracts issued consecutively. There are laws as well as case law that prevent people receiving massive pay cuts for when they are doing equivalent work to the full-time salaries that other people in the same organization are doing, and indeed that they themselves did prior to 60, but this is why after 60 senior figures may find themselves increasingly sidelined. There is also a new 2021 Act which provides what is called an effort obligation for employers to offer employment from 65 to 70. Basically, they're expected to try, but there's no strict necessity that companies need to offer employment to their former employees as they reach 65. This could be interpreted by companies as raising the retirement age to 70, which it doesn't seem that Nintendo are doing, or offer alternative continuous employment to 70, but it could also include hiring workers running their own businesses as independent contractors after 65, or allowing them to work at non-profits or social projects, which may not even be directly paid. What does retirement traditionally look like, though, for these huge Japanese companies? It's common, though not mandatory, to offer a lump sum payment upon retirement that's reflective through some mathematical formulation of the years of service and the salary at retirement. Okay, that's the general background of retirement in Japan, but what about Nintendo specifically? Well, on their website, Nintendo state the following about their senior employees. They say, Nintendo Company Limited, Japan, has a flexible working system to support employees continuing to work in a way that complements their personal circumstances, such as family or health, as well as design their post-retirement life in a way that suits each of their values and goals. Almost all permanent employees 50 years of age or older can choose to work flexibly based on personal preference by utilizing the system to take 3 days off a week and shorten daily work hours. By also allowing a broader range of concurrent and second jobs and supporting outside activities such as hobbies, we provide employees with opportunities to increase their future options. In addition, we offer generation-specific training through which we work together to devise future life plans at each milestone age and raise awareness of the systems that human resources offers. End quote. So this is pretty interesting and suggests that from age 50, Nintendo employees are handed differential contracts. This might also explain why certain senior figures like Katsuya Yamano or Torosawa seem to go very quiet late in their careers despite seeing occasional credits on games. It's not just that they've been moved to more senior roles which might be less directly involved with the day-to-day of game development, but perhaps also that they're working part-time and so with more limited hours. Although they're still keeping a foot in the door of the company, they're broadly focused on offering advice to younger generations. This is a very significant transition, and I'm actually surprised that it takes place as early as age 50. Of course, this does have direct implications for the ability of senior Nintendo figures to be involved or less involved with the company. Eiji Aonuma is a senior officer of the company, but it appears that the actual day-to-day manager of the Zelda department is Daiki Iwamoto. Shinya Takahashi, who turns 63 in November, is the executive responsible for EPD, the game development group, but the actual manager of the group is Yoshiaki Koizumi, and note that since the final Switch Direct in March 2025, Takahashi hasn't actually been seen in one of these presentations. Far from a fixed event, what seems to be the case is that Nintendo accommodates a far more gradual diminution of responsibilities between the ages of 50 and 65, although of course this likely has financial implications as well. For Takaya Imamura, he might have felt this to be a good opportunity to pursue his independent projects. However free Nintendo producers are to enjoy hobbies, I doubt they're able to create products that in theory directly compete with the company after all, and perhaps if he was facing an albeit slight reduction in his wage, he might have considered it time to try something new. I would guess Hideki Kono decided to take that lump sum at 60 and sail off into the sunset. But what of those who go on, or who might go on, past 65? Let's look at a few examples. Firstly, Miyamoto. Miyamoto turned 65 in November 2017. However, by 2015 he had left management at EPD, albeit largely enforced because of the loss of Iwata. In 2015, he was given the executive role as a creative fellow at Nintendo. It seems plausible that this contract is on a one-year renewing basis, where the work hours might be less onerous than full-time employment, although of course Miyamoto still has plenty to do supervising IP efforts such as films and theme park attractions, doing press for the films, sitting in on several investor meetings, presenting direct, and occasionally kibitzing as an advisor on games such as F-Zero 99 and Pikmin 4. Next, let's consider Kimishima. Kimishima was 65 when he took on the presidency of Nintendo, which was the very definition of a new contract at 65. When he retired at 68, he was still spotted in meetings by Kit and Krista, and this seems likely to be an example of someone being offered continuity work, especially given his importance to the company. There are certain roles that may be particularly useful for former presidents to be able to enact, such as performance management appraisals for the current president, and so I could certainly see Kimishima continuing to pop up from time to time. Now, let's look at the current retiree in the news, Takashi Tezuka, who retired from his executive position but has confirmed that he will still be involved in production. However, this is not the same as continuing on the same terms or with the same contract as before he reached 65. I do think Nintendo take very seriously that age of 65, and they will want to try to do something that they can make sure is consistent across all their large number of employees, even if they are making particular accommodations for a few very specific senior developers. Tezuka's experience is obviously a tremendous boon to the company. He was the assistant director on the original Super Mario Bros. After all, and the director of the first Zelda game, among many other startlingly brilliant credits. However, my guess is that he and the company will review his involvement on an annual basis going forward. This may affect other figures. Take Monolith Soft's Tetsuya Takahashi. Takahashi, by all accounts, is passionate about still leading the narrative development of Monolith Soft games, but Nintendo bought out the shares of the small group of Monolith Soft founders in 2024 so that they could fully own the company, and it seems plausible that he will continue to progressively refocus his attention, not necessarily retiring outright, and probably preserving the creative focus he's clearly so passionate about, potentially well past 65, but this doesn't mean he will be quite so directly involved in day-to-day affairs, in the management of the company, or anything like that to the same extent as before. Consider once again Yoshio Sakamoto. Sakamoto was once reasonably prolific, but after the 3DS era, when he was in his late 50s, he seems to have become someone who has far less on his plate. We know that the production group he usually worked with was EPD7, but they haven't really been credited separately for a very long time now, and the key figures seem to be a part of EPD4 in recent games. It strikes me as likely, therefore, that he stepped back from full-time work during this period, part of that graduated retirement process, still being involved in Samus Returns and Metroid Dread, and also shepherding the Famicom Detective Club games, although note that majors were kept waiting a year for a reply when they first pitched this title. I always assumed this was because Nintendo in 2016 or 2017 were hardly wanted to commit funds to such a niche endeavour, and so it just really wasn't on their radar, but there may be a more practical reason that Sakamoto's time was simply far more limited if he was working only 2 days a week and on limited hours. Perhaps he simply hasn't been a full-time member of Nintendo for a long, long time already. Then there's Koichi Hayashida. Hayashida has been one of the most intriguing members of the Nintendo team as the director of the 3D Mario titles of the 2010s. In late 2018 or early 2019, he left the Tokyo EPD8 group, where he had been the senior producer, and moved instead to support on Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Granted, this was enormously successful at reviving the fortunes of the 2D Mario series, which seemed to many to have been stuck in a rut during the new Super Mario Bros. Era, but it did represent an apparent step down for Hayashida. However, the timing is conspicuous. In 2019, Hayashida turned 50. Might it be that Hayashida decided to take full advantage of Nintendo's willingness to offer a far more flexible working arrangement for over 50s, thereby allowing Kenta Motakura to seamlessly step up as EPD8 chief, and for Hayashida to help guide the new generation of 2D Mario producers? Inevitably, the decision of when to retire is largely a personal one. The people we're talking about are generational talents, titans in their field, and Nintendo isn't going to want to lose people who can benefit the company. Nevertheless, there is a natural rhythm to a career, and without people like Hayashida and Connor making way, you might not have seen the promotion of Motakura and Mario Kart and ARMS producer Kosuke Ibuki. I also suspect Nintendo's distinctive manner of intensive mentoring benefits from having the top figures having a little more time to walk the halls and have discussions, including unprompted ones, with the younger developers. What does this actually mean about Nintendo's current senior generation, therefore? Eiji Aonuma shows no sign of actually retiring, but he is approaching 65, and with Fujibayashi, Iwamoto, and Echoes of Wisdom director Tomomi Sano there, he's well set to step back and still feel assured that Zelda is in safe hands. It seems completely plausible that he might already have cut his hours right back, and that if he continues past 65, it will be in a kind of Miyamoto-style role as a global troubleshooter for the Zelda property and a general cheerleader for Hyrule. For Tezuka, I guess his role will be far less integrated with the game development branch of the company over time, and we will see the contours of a new configuration of the company take shape irrespective of his employment status, because of course there will be that new building and some kind of big move in 2029. In fact, we can already see this a little bit, as in a couple of recent games, so Princess Peach Showtime and Mario & Luigi Brothership, he's been credited not as a supervisor or a producer, but in the relatively unusual title of Senior Supervisor. He was still the credited producer on Meet Up in Bellabelle Park and Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, but I wouldn't be too surprised if on future titles his involvement will be defined more as a senior supervisor than being in the engine room of game development full-time. I think there will be a different full-time producer attached to most of these games going forward, even if Tezuka remains involved. Then there's the ever-controversial Kensuke Tanabe. I think Tanabe was obviously right to say that Beyond will be the last Prime he'd be running, because the development time on the next game, even if it started right away, would likely be long enough that Tanabe would be in his late 60s or gone 70 by the time it would release. We know he has handed Paper Mario's producer role to Risa Tabata, and there's every evidence that Tabata will also take Prime from him. He may still appear working on titles like Luigi's Mansion, although my suspicion is that there are other people like Ikebata who are more critical to that series' direction. My assumption, though, is that whether or not Tanabe is heading straight for the exit or doing the kind of reduced role for a couple of years that other people seem to have been doing, the nature of his role has changed, and perhaps even changed long before Prime 4 released. For Shinya Takahashi, I would also be skeptical about expecting him to continue past 65 in his role as currently configured. It seems likely that he might remain in place as an executive board member, supervising matters in general, but it seems that Koizumi has already effectively taken the management of EPD on. When did he take on this role? 2023. What else happened in 2023? Takahashi turned 60. I think they take these milestones seriously. However, we need to end where we began by really drilling down into Yoshio Sakamoto. You see, I think there is one thing that we need to particularly consider with Sakamoto, which is his deep and unusual history with Metroid. Now, that in itself isn't necessarily critical to whether or not they keep somebody on. This year we saw Star Fox return with minimal involvement from people who knew Star Fox of old, with only a vague credit for Shigeru Miyamoto, and with Imamura seemingly not consulted at all. However, I think it is almost completely certain that Nintendo is currently targeting a Metroid IP expansion of some form. Probably a film, possibly a television series, maybe some kind of theme park attraction or merch series. Whatever they're doing, though, I think this is their absolute aim. Why do I think this? Well, this decade they've had a succession of big Metroid titles despite the series' fairly anemic sales history. Nintendo isn't averse to being persistent, but it also doesn't want to throw good money after bad. They want to keep trying new things, to keep trying to push Metroid, and having all of these projects hitting around now gives them the best possible springboard to create a big buzz around Metroid and try to sell it, hoping therefore that the raised profile for Metroid will in turn lead back to higher sales for the game. Granted, the mixed reception that Metroid Prime 4 received surely didn't help, but Nintendo wouldn't have known how that game would fare when they put this plan into place. And if it's true, as seems probable, that there is a Metroid 6 coming around the corner, possibly some Nintendo Switch 2 editions as well, perhaps even another title such as a Pixel remake on the cards, well, I think they will want someone to be the brand ambassador for Metroid during this period. Now, if a new game started post-Dread, Sakamoto was unambiguously at Nintendo and was working as a producer, so he likely did shepherd a potential Metroid 6 and may well be credited in this role. I will say, given his love of horror and given the way Metroid Dread ended, I can particularly see him having ideas for the sixth title in the series. Now, this does not mean that as of 2026, when a potential game may theoretically be content complete, that he's still there and certainly not in the same role. My best hunch is that he did, in fact, retire as a producer at Nintendo in 2024 when he turned 65. As I say, I think they do take that milestone seriously, but that he and Nintendo may, emphasis on may, have an arrangement where he continues on a far more limited capacity to serve as a consultant and brand ambassador specifically for the Metroid series. This would explain why he wouldn't be talking up Tomodachi Life, which after all has a group of young developers with a great history of the series. It would also explain why he would need an air on Famicom Detective Club, as theoretically this would be outside the terms of his contract going forward, even though I'm sure he would want to pop his head around the door and find out what was happening. But Metroid is in a far more delicate state, and there is yet to be any obvious successor who can speak for the whole history of the property. Moreover, this would absolutely dovetail with Sakamoto's passions. We know he loves films, particularly horror films, such as the work of the Italian auteur Dario Argento. The chance to be involved in the incubation of a Metroid audiovisual project would probably be something he would be very happy to pursue. But I think we'd be looking at a Miyamoto 2017 situation here. Even if Sakamoto is credited on Metroid 6 for work that took place from 2021 to 2024, which, let's face it, is probably the bulk of development, I think Fumio Hayashi, the new director, and Mercury Steam probably can carry that project on alone, and Nintendo don't want to end up in the situation where they're endlessly reliant on one aging genius and don't have a sufficient bulk of talent in depth. But I can absolutely see the case from both Sakamoto's perspective and Nintendo's for him to continue to work on a more occasional basis on the development of the Metroid property. So all things considered, what have we learnt? For one thing, I think it's worth looking at the age range of 50 to 70 as a longer and more graduated process of retirement in modern day Nintendo. It's not just that some figures will hit 65 and bash the retirement button, but that many of the top people who are responsible for the great games Nintendo produce are already going to be in a reduced capacity at the company, more advisory than in the weeds of development. We should probably be particularly cautious with developers as they cross those 5-year milestones 50, 55, 60, and 65, as these do seem to correlate with specific renegotiations of positions, and I think we can expect that there is a standard retirement age of 65, even if some people are rehired for continued work after 65. Indeed, I do slightly wonder if the reason that there was an announcement of Tezuka leaving and then the subsequent announcement that he was actually still going to be around after all was possibly partly to do with the fact that there were still ongoing negotiations about exactly what his future role might be. And that would make sense because, after all, it's probably linked very much to Mario, and with the Mario film only releasing this spring, all of that would still be up in the air until quite recently. Now, look, some of these top figures of the company will look for their own reasons to leave in their 50s, and because Nintendo clearly has an expectation of their senior figures in terms of what they're going to offer to the company, there does seem to be a subtle pressure to make 65 the central retirement date. However, some figures may continue beyond through to 70, and evidently Miyamoto shows that even 70 is not a permanent barrier, although I suspect he is a very special case for Nintendo. However, I rather doubt Nintendo would want this to be a standard thing. As terrific as it is to have the resources of such senior individuals, they do not want to communicate that anybody is irreplaceable, and they also don't want to offer overly generous contracts to senior figures when it comes to game development, which is after all a long-term process, and so they might see people retire midway through the development of game, which would be disruptive for their overall schedule. Lighter advisory continuity posts might therefore be the best option for creating a graduated retirement for some of these people, and I would expect, particularly with people like Aonuma, and also quite potentially with someone like Sakamoto, this is what we might see. Thank you as ever for watching. Consider checking out the Patreon for early, ad-free and exclusive content, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.